Welcome to the inaugural season of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, the podcast. I'm your host, Sunil Rajaraman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Yasha Kakis-Wolf.
Sunil, my favorite headline in the San Francisco Chronicle in 2017, I think, is Rich SF residents get a shock. Someone bought their street. So it turns out there's this story where somewhere up in the Sea Cliffs, this couple, a Presidio Terrace actually, this couple ended up waiting for an access road and kind of a neighborhood, almost people's like driveways, to come up onto auction because the HOA was so busy with other stuff that this couple ended up being able to buy all these people's driveways, which seems like completely ridiculous, but also in the context of San Francisco, almost feels like, well, yeah, everybody here's so busy with their stuff that you could just forget that somebody else could buy your driveway out from underneath you.
I think the thing that shocked a lot of people was not only that it happened, but it further exacerbates, I think, something that happens in San Francisco and many other cities just under the surface, where you have somebody who is from the other side of the road doing something a little scrappier. And so it clearly pits the well-to-do against folks who just found an opportunity.
It's kind of like the promise of around here. At least it's the promise that drew me to the Bay Area. Like, I came here because I thought, I grew up as a poor kid outside of Eugene, Oregon, and I went to school in LA at a little liberal arts school. I didn't get to say Harvard in the first 2 minutes of our conversation, so you know that I didn't go there. But I went to this little school in Southern California, and I made my way to the Bay Area because I believed that there was a promise here that I could work my ass off, and if I worked my ass off, I could be as successful as anybody else.
At the same time, the extremes are pretty notable these days in politics and really in everything, in economic disparity. For our guest today, Rick Marini, he talks a little bit about, taking a more centrist approach to solving some of San Francisco's problems. And I really enjoyed talking to him about that.
He's had many successful kind of investments and ventures in the technology world. But to your point, like this conversation with this as his background, all this experience and expertise that he has a really clean view into like, here's how you approach living in San Francisco as a pragmatist.
He's a longtime San Francisco resident who moved here from the East Coast and is active in the technology world. He can demystify and does in fact demystify Bitcoin for a lot of people during this interview. And that's what he's spending most of his time on.
We don't talk to Rick about this, but he is on the advisory board for DreamWorks and AngelList and also Aston Martin Racing, which we didn't talk about. And I think we need to have him back on so we just can talk about car racing.
Let's do that next time. But for now, enjoy this interview with Rick Marini.
We really appreciate you being here today on This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley podcast. And as we do in this podcast for our listeners, we start with a bit of grounding in the culture of San Francisco. What Sunil and I both have felt and had conversations about over the last couple of years is how many of the people that we know in San Francisco aren't actually from San Francisco. And he growing up in Cleveland and me growing up in Oregon have some things about our youth that have contributed to how we show up here and the culture and the community that we interact with. And we love hearing those stories. So we want to start out with first and just ask you where you grew up.
So I grew up in New Hampshire, small town in southern New Hampshire called Merrimack, between Manchester and Nashua, which are the two biggest cities there. But, my town was about 18,000 people, so pretty small. But we were an hour north of Boston. So, Boston is really the big city that I relate to. And been out here in Silicon Valley and San Francisco for the last almost 20 years. So although I definitely call this home, my roots are back east.
Yeah. So Boston and New Hampshire, I'm a West Coast guy. I grew up in Oregon, lived in Southern California, then here, and even Washington a little bit. Talk a little bit about the relationship between Boston and New Hampshire. Maybe even I thought about them as the same thing, which you can kick me into the table for if you want.
Well, Boston is definitely the area that you want to be as a young person. Much more culture, much more diversity than New Hampshire. New Hampshire's, it's a nice place to grow up. It's safe and it's, got good schools and all. But I think later on, coming from New Hampshire, Boston is kind of aspirational. You want to move there.
Got it.
And I did live in Boston for several years, went to grad school at Harvard Business School, and then started my first company in Boston. And I loved my time there.
Yeah.
Loved Boston and still do today. And there's actually a lot of parallels, I'd say, between San Francisco and Boston, right? They're both.
How should I think about Boston as a West Coaster, as a San Franciscan?
So, some of the parallels would be Boston and San Francisco, both, they're on the water. They both have highly educated kind of demographic. You've got great schools, right? MIT and Harvard, and then Stanford and Berkeley out here. They're both pretty tech focused.
Yeah.
Boston back in the 80s and 90s was really, a great tech hub. A lot of hardware and software companies where the internet companies really took off out here.
Yeah.
What I don't miss about Boston is the weather. The weather was brutal growing up back east. I don't miss that at all. And, now where things are in technology, I think San Francisco is definitely the place to be over Boston. I think you can still do, interesting things in tech in Boston, but not what you can do as a startup. I think San Francisco or Silicon Valley is unique to the world in terms of being able to start companies here.
Where do you currently live in the city?
So I live in Russian Hill in the city, and I've actually lived in the city, various places for, like I said, almost 20 years. And we finally plunked down roots. I've got a wife and 2 kids. We bought a house, and we're here for the long haul.
What's the single biggest change you've seen maybe in the last decade in San Francisco? If there's been, aside from the obvious, obviously we're here during the greatest period of wealth creation since the Renaissance. Basically, there's been a lot of nice buildings and all that put up, but any other observations, cultural observations you'd make about San Francisco?
Well, I'm a tech entrepreneur, so a lot of the way that I view San Francisco or my life is through that tech lens. And one of the interesting things that I've seen in San Francisco over maybe the last 5 years is that a lot of the entrepreneurs that used to live maybe in Palo Alto, coming out of Stanford or Menlo Park or even San Jose, down that area, all of these 20-something entrepreneurs want to live in San Francisco for lots of obvious reasons, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a much more vibrant city. There's more diversity. There's just more fun stuff to do here. But, the VCs started to see that. They identified that pattern and said, okay, we need to get away from Sand Hill Road down in Menlo and get up to San Francisco and follow these entrepreneurs up here if we want to get in the best deals. So now South Park and SoMa has become kind of VC central, where you've got, a ton of those buildings are now housed with VCs. And what that to me is going to drive is that more and more companies will be funded here and therefore started here. And it's going to accelerate a flywheel. And this is why I'm an optimist on San Francisco for the next 10 years, is that not only have we created great innovation, but when the money is here and the best entrepreneurs are here, you're just going to have more successes coming out of here with it, which is inspirational for the next set of entrepreneurs. And when the money's here, that's when the entrepreneurs are going to come here as well. So for me, San Francisco is going to continue to be that innovation center for at least the next decade.
Do you feel like the VC community and new companies showing up in San Francisco in particular is benefiting all of San Francisco? How do you feel about your relationship into the arts community, or kind of your relationship with civics and kind of civic responsibility over the course of the last several years and their relationship into the VC community?
So overall, I think it's a positive thing that we are such an innovative, creative city, and a lot of that is driven by tech. That said, obviously there's a lot of artists that don't have the salaries that techies have. And when you have a situation on the housing side where there's far more demand than supply, and you've got one group that can't afford what the other group can, you start to displace people that are really important to the culture of the city. So I definitely see that as a downside. There's not an easy solution for that.
Yeah.
And I'm not coming here with one today, but overall, I believe that when you're the center of innovation for the world, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
The hope is that you can somehow bring some of that wealth creation to help others continue to be in this city that are so important to the city, especially on the art side.
Yeah. Do you get an opportunity to think about that as an investor in San Francisco? Are you thinking about the kinds of businesses that you're investing in and trying to bring into San Francisco? Or is it more about an opportunity in a space?
It's more about the opportunity in the space.
Yeah.
Most of the companies I invest in are in Silicon Valley. And I mean, if I was to drill in, I bet most of them are in San Francisco.
Yeah.
For the same reasons I just gave. So I'm not looking as an investor to specifically try to bring certain companies into San Francisco.
Yeah.
As an investor, that when I have that hat on, I'm just looking at, is this the right team? Is it the right opportunity? Things that a traditional investor will look at.
Yeah. Russian Hill's a pretty awesome neighborhood. Do you ever leave Russian Hill, other than work?
We love it there, but we've got 2 young kids, so we're always at Barry Discover Museum or at parks or doing stuff with the kids.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite part? Is one a specific park that you guys like to go to?
So we are on the North Beach side of Russian Hill, and there's a new park that went up about 2 years ago called Joe DiMaggio Park. That's awesome.
Yeah.
5-minute walk from our place, beautiful park, and we spend a lot of time there.
Yeah. I love that. I lived in the city. I live in Marin now, but I lived in the city for a while. And we used to love the fact that we could find like a neighborhood park that we could go to. Our kids are a little older now. We're 14 to 8 now, 3.
Yeah,
And
I grew up in New Hampshire, so I want to expose my kids to the outdoors.
Yeah.
And so, we'll spend time in the Presidio and walking around there or doing hikes in Marin.
Yeah.
I want them to have both, a city life and to be able to see some of the things I didn't see until later on in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But getting out in nature and running around and getting scraped knees and all that stuff, that's part of being a kid, and that's important.
One term that you hear a lot in San Francisco and the Bay Area in general is this notion of an echo chamber. And whether it's in tech news or in politics, where San Francisco is largely politically homogenous. What are your thoughts on that part of the San Francisco culture? And is it good? Is it bad? Does it matter?
So I only have a couple major knocks on San Francisco, and that's actually one of them. So, I'm a registered independent. I did a lot of work for the Obama campaign a couple of years ago and, really believed in that president. And one of the issues with San Francisco, though, is that last election, I believe we voted 93% Democrat. And there's really no second voice in the room. And that's been an issue that I've seen here for many years. Although I did vote Democrat, I was part of that 93%, but I feel like we don't have the full level of discourse that we could have, especially around politics. And right now we've got a very polarizing president, so it's really hard to have that discussion from both sides. But I feel like, I've been here long enough through, a couple different presidencies that we've never really had that. And I think that's one of the few shortcomings of the city.
When you saw the election result, or maybe this is something you don't really even think about, is Trump good for business or bad for business?
He was positioned that he was going to be good for business. He came from business. He didn't come from politics. He's got some good people around him, like Gary Cohn and others. When you have someone that's unpredictable, that's bad for business. Even if you have someone that says, I want tax reform and I want all these things that are on the business side, not, forget the wall and other crazy stuff he wants to do, but just specifically on your question on business, markets don't like unpredictability. And that's what he's brought. And the inability for the administration to get health care passed, therefore makes it that much harder probably to get tax reform passed. And that, to me, if you're the pro-business guy and you can't get any legislation approved, then you really aren't that valuable to the business community.
Drilling down a little bit more to make it San Francisco centric, we've seen that he doesn't mind taking shots at the tech community. In fact, he seems to abhor the tech community to a certain extent. Are you worried about the FTC randomly cracking down on Facebook, Google, and other places that have an anti-Trump stance?
I think one of the reasons that he is anti-tech is because 90% of the tech community was against him. And I think that he's very reactive that way and emotional and probably immature to react that way instead of looking at the bigger picture. But because he is an emotional guy, yes, he could react in a way to try to use the FTC's power against companies like that. To me, it depends on what they're trying to do, to Facebook or Google. If it's around privacy issues that they should be thinking about already, I'm okay with that. Mm-hmm. If it's just to be vindictive, then that's really bad for the whole ecosystem. I mean, you do have Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Apple. Those 5 control a huge amount of power around the world, but especially in tech and Silicon Valley. So there should be some checks on all those companies, especially around privacy. And that is a good thing. But when you use power to be vindictive, then that's not going to fly here. And I think for most people around the world, they're not going to want that either.
There's a discussion that Sunil and I have around this idea that some of the things that happen in Silicon Valley get fetishized, and they're tried, maybe entrepreneurs and maybe individuals think that just because it's happening in Silicon Valley, it should be happening everywhere else. So we have this long-going discussion around what are the things that we see that are happening right now in the Bay Area that we want to see happen elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, I think there's there's more than one. So give me a couple here because
Yeah.
it's such an exciting time in Silicon Valley. I'll give you 3 examples. One would be the on-demand economy and how that's transformed the way that we live here. So San Francisco or Silicon Valley is lucky because we are the test bed for a lot of on-demand companies. So VCs will invest money, institutional money, into these companies, and then they need to test it somewhere. And most of these companies are started here, so the obvious place to start it is your backyard, right?
Yeah.
So we get to benefit from trying all these new things, and most of it is at the expense of the VC, right? They're subsidizing a lot of what we get to benefit from as consumers to see if it's going to stick or not. And really, like Uber and Lyft are still subsidized by institutional investors. I mean, we can ride pretty cheap because of that. In the on-demand economy, like for us, my wife and I are using Uber or Lyft every single day. We order Instacart at least twice a week because we've got kids and we're always forgetting or we need more fruit or milk or whatever. I don't have to stand in line at Whole Foods. I actually have someone that goes and does our shopping, and then this is all through Instacart, and they go to Whole Foods and they bring it to us, and we pay some small fee for that. Like, what a great use of unlocking my time to go let someone else do that and pay them for that too, which is great. And then, if you want food delivered, there's Caviar, Uber Eats, or DoorDash, or so on. Even my 3-year-old daughter knows about all these services by name.
Yeah.
Like last night I came home after a dinner and I rushed home and she's like, "Dad, did you take an Uber home?" And I said, "Yeah, I did, because I wanted to make sure I got home to put you to bed." My 3-year-old is calling out Uber, or she'll say, "Hey, Daddy, can you order this on Amazon Prime so it's, I have it tomorrow." She's 3 years old, right? So all these on-demand economy companies that are specific, or at least started in San Francisco. Many of them never even make it out of San Francisco.
Yeah.
But we get to benefit from that and be the guinea pig, and I think that's a really cool thing here. And I think that a lot of those services have broad applicability. Many of them might be focused on cities, but still broad applicability outside of San Francisco. So that's one, on demand. Number 2, that I'm sure you've talked about with other guests, would be autonomous vehicles. A lot of that work is being done in Silicon Valley. I'm super excited about that. I think we're still 5 to 10 years out of mass adoption. We still have some safety hurdles to get through and regulatory, but once that's there, it will change the way that people are transported, that goods are transported. I mean, it's going to take tons of cost out of the system. And my daughter, who's 3, may never have to drive herself, which is bizarre to me, but that's coming soon. The third area that I'm super excited about, again, not specific to only San Francisco, but I believe a lot of innovation will come in from San Francisco in this area, and that's crypto. So blockchain is going to have a huge impact on the world, not to the degree that the internet did when people were like, "Oh, blockchain's the new internet." That's like saying, any basketball player is the next Michael Jordan, or hockey player the next Wayne Gretzky. Like, that's a really high bar. But blockchain is going to change industries, both consumer and definitely enterprise. And crypto is just getting started. So I'm a big believer in that industry. I think a lot of great companies will be built in the Bay Area around this. And I'm super excited for that.
Let's maybe bring the listeners who aren't as familiar with blockchain and crypto brief up to speed. If you had to give a 30-second explanation or less of blockchain, what is it exactly?
So blockchain is basically a digital ledger. Think about like a digital database where different transactions are stored, and they're stored not by one individual like bank, but it's actually on a ledger that everyone can see and everyone can check. So it really democratizes the way that transactions can be done in a way that everyone contributes to and everybody can see. So you have that level of trust. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum or different tokens that are coming through ICOs are a way to be able to transact on the blockchain, to be able to trade back and forth. And those are 2 different currencies, Bitcoin and Ethereum.
What do you say to the person that's skeptical of cryptocurrency that says, "Look, I don't understand it. I don't transact with it. I don't see myself ever using anything other than a credit card. And it looks like currency speculation where some people are making bundles of money right now, but I want to stay away from that"?
I say that we are probably in like 1996 in internet time, which was a time when everything that had .com at the end of it all of a sudden was worth 10x, and things got really frothy, and you had a lot of pets.coms that went out of business, and you had a couple companies like Amazon or Google or Yahoo or others that came out of that and changed the world. And right now is a highly volatile time to be an investor in crypto, but I do believe that crypto will change the world. And it doesn't mean you're going to use Bitcoin to buy your daily coffee next week, but there are lots of different applications for crypto, especially on the enterprise side, that will change the way that the world works. So I would say coming soon, like 1996, there's a lot ahead of us in the internet back then. If you're not an expert in the space, you probably should not be investing in the space. But just know that this is coming soon, and it will be a big deal for the world, this transparency and ability to all contribute to something together.
And on the on-demand, just to follow up on that one, also from the skeptical person's viewpoint and as someone who started an on-demand company, why should I trust what you're building with on-demand companies? It sounds like this is a nice convenience for rich people to have, but is it really going to apply to my life in Cleveland? And why should I care about it? I'm kind of skeptical sitting on my couch here looking at you, Silicon Valley people who order things and have people pick up things for you.
Yeah, and that's what I said. I think there's broad applicability to cities, but not necessarily to the smaller towns where it may not scale. In cities where you've got people living in, kind of close quarters and it's easier for delivery, you've got closer delivery from the store to the people, you've got people who highly value their time and that are working a lot of hours in the city. I think that a lot of these, including Uber and Lyft, but definitely an Instacart, works better in the city. And I think when you make a determination on what your time is worth. And most people in the cities, I think, on average, get paid more than if you're in the suburbs. Those people will make a conscious choice to say, I'm willing to pay for that service because it saves me time. So that, to me, is the trade-off. I mean, if there's enough people in a geographic area, whether it's Cleveland or San Francisco or New York or London, if there's enough of those people that are willing to give up money in exchange for their time and make that trade-off, then that type of service could exist, as long as the unit economics for that service makes sense. So as an example, I was an investor in a company called Lux, which was on-demand parking. Like Uber, you'd have an app and you'd say, I'm here, and they would come and pick up your car, and then they'd go park it. In the city, that can save you a lot of time. In the suburbs, that would never fly. So it really depends on the service and whether or not it can scale beyond a city.
I'm still thinking about the implications of autonomous cars and our kids identities. Growing up in the country, getting to the point where I had a car was a big part of what made me an adult, or at least that's what I thought.
That freedom.
And our kids, I don't think really have to think about that. Your 3-year-old is like, maybe she never has a car. My 8-year-old also is the same thing. He's like, Dad, I don't think I'm going to have a car. I'm just going to have one pick me up and take me where I need to go.
Right.
And it just is not going to have a person in it.
And it's going to change. I mean, even if you think about real estate prices. So, let's say that you live in the suburbs now, and maybe your house, is worth a little bit less because you've got more work to do to get to the city, and or less than if you were in the city by square foot. And you have to own a car and all that stuff because you live in the suburbs. If you can have autonomous vehicles just pick you up every time and it doesn't cost that much, all of a sudden, people want to leave the city, which has been the trend has been for the last 20, 30 years. Everyone's coming to the cities. But if you don't actually have to live in the city because you can work a full day and then just pop in the back of a car and do phone calls or do work or whatever, and you don't have to pay attention, that starts to get more attractive to live in the suburbs, right? So I think there's going to be all sorts of things. And then, if you think about all the parking lots that don't have to exist, if you think about insurance that doesn't have to exist, and being able to consolidate, things like maintenance and all that stuff on cars, like all sorts of things are going to change. But the biggest thing will be you don't have to drive yourself anymore, and our kids won't either.
Yeah.
Like our kids don't even know a world my kids don't know without internet.
Yeah.
Like when we're in our car and we jump on Waze or Google Maps or whatever, we know exactly to the minute what time we're going to arrive someplace an hour later.
Yeah.
And it's really accurate. Just 20 years ago, you're using paper maps. This is 20 years ago, all this has changed. So, so it's super exciting time to be in tech and going back to the San Francisco theme. This is the place. This to me is the epicenter of tech in the entire world. And that's why I'm so excited and optimistic to be here.
Something to think about. None of us are from the Bay Area originally, or Sunil kind of is, but it's debatable. He was born in Saratoga, then he went to Ohio. But I say that because I think that there's a lot of myths that exist about the Bay Area from outside the Bay Area. So what's the number one myth that you want to dispel about the Bay Area for anybody that's not in the Bay Area?
We've got a lot of interest from around the world in what we do here. You've got everything from movies like The Social Network about Facebook to Silicon Valley, the HBO show, which I love and it's great. But I think people think it's easier to build a company than it is, okay? And, I've built 3 and I know how hard it is. I've invested in 50 as an angel investor, so I really know how hard it is. And I think it's kind of the equivalent of, thinking, hey, I want to be an actor. I'm going to be the next Brad Pitt. I'm just going to go to LA and it's going to happen. like coming out here and be like, I want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. It's just going to happen. And the reality is for anybody, coming out here, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. 85% of startups fail. So just because you're out here doesn't at all guarantee any kind of level of success. That said, I don't think there's any place better to start a company than San Francisco. I think we have an ecosystem that is very open and shares knowledge and information. Very different than Boston or New York. I lived in Boston for years, and I feel like back east it's a bit more transactional, where people are a bit more closed off and maybe want you to sign an NDA. Like we would never, if someone says sign an NDA here, it's a red flag. Like you're not from here, you don't know what you're doing, because we just share information, right? I mean, that is one of the coolest things about San Francisco to me, is that it's all about execution, not just ideas. I want to share ideas. I want to get feedback. I'm not afraid you're going to steal my idea as long as I believe I can execute on my idea.
I think it's a great myth, right? You don't just show up here and magically your startup idea becomes a thing.
Yeah, a lot harder than that. And it's something that, I've talked about with lots of aspiring entrepreneurs and hopefully saved some heartache from them. They were probably disappointed by the end of my discussion with them on how hard it is. But, you need to know what you're getting into. And Silicon Valley it's a place where you can follow that dream, just like you could follow the dream in LA to be a great actor. But just understand what it takes to actually succeed at that dream.
That's a great call.
If you had a magic wand and could fix a few things about San Francisco tomorrow, civic issues, whatever they might be, what would be on your list? It could be bigger than a top three. It could be smaller than a top three.
So number one, and I know you've heard this before from other folks, is homelessness. We continue to have a homelessness problem that needs to be fixed. I've been here 18 years, and it hasn't gotten any better in 18 years, which is a real shame considering how much San Francisco has benefited from the tech boom, how much money has come here, both as an investment and as taxes, and it's disappointing to me, greatly disappointing to me, that we haven't done more to fix the problem.
Why is that? Why don't we take the wealth that's been accumulated and fix this problem? It just seems so easy. Instead, wealth is accumulated and invested in other startups, or that's our kind of way of giving forward.
Yeah, I don't think it is easy at all, actually, because I think you've got multiple constituencies that either have competing interests or have an interest that may be different than mine. So what I say there is that I've seen homeless people on the same corner for the last 10 years. I know people who have given them lots of money and opportunity, and they still end up back there. And I don't know if that's substance abuse problems or if they really just don't want to have any responsibility. They don't want the job that was offered to them. Maybe they just like their life that way, and that's going to continue for some people. For others, I think that, and this will get me in trouble, which you guys probably love, I think San Francisco is too lenient sometimes. I don't think that they've taken a direct enough stance to say, we are going to change this. New York cleaned up Times Square. And it was painful for a year or two for people, but it cleaned it up. And now it's this super vibrant place that's, that's a real tourist attraction now, not just a place where cars, come and go. And I would love to see a elected official here take a tougher stance and say, we are going to fix this problem. It's just gone on too long. So I'd love to see that.
Let's talk about Twitter. Who are your two highest recommended right now, today, follows on Twitter?
So Naval Ravikant is a good friend of mine, has been for a long time, and he is one of the brightest guys in the Valley. And that's a super high bar for me to say that, but he is. And Naval is also an expert in cryptocurrencies, which I'm obviously very into.
Yeah.
And Naval is just smart on everything. I mean, just anything he says, I'm always listening. But what he's talking about in crypto and blockchain is part of the inspiration for me to really get involved in that world. And I think he's an awesome person to follow. Another is my friend Tim Ferriss. Tim is a kind of a health wellness guru that is, he's put his own body and brain through lots of trials to be able to figure out what's on the other side. And then as a fun one, I love the Rogue White House. This is supposed to be people inside the White House that are tweeting what's really going on. We don't know for sure if they're in the White House or not. I mean, some of the things they say feels like they are, but I check that every day. There's some frustration because it's like, oh, nothing's changing there, and there's definitely entertainment value.
You're like, that's a fun one. The chaos of the country.
Rick, it was great having you on the This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley podcast.
Thank you, guys. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, the podcast. We are always looking for great topic suggestions and suggestions for future guests. Email us at info@thebolditalic.com if you have suggestions on either. Thanks for spending some of your time today with us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of Season 1.